If you own enough that you never need to rent, you definitely own way too much. Quickbase was going to allow us the opportunity to take our spreadsheets out of spreadsheet land and put them into the cloud. Usually at that 2 weeks and a day point, it tips over to be the monthly rate anyway. So you really have it for free for the next week and a half. When you build it in Quickbase, it can also plug into your OSHA side of compliance, where the inspection software, not so much.
Well, Rob, thanks for joining us this week. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. My name's Rob Coakley. I'm the equipment manager at Lithko Contracting. I've been with them since 2008, so this is year 16 for me. Prior to that, I was in the rental industry since 1996. So been in this part of the world for quite some time now, both sides of it, from the equipment rental side and now on the contractor side. And that's what we do.
Dude, I'm so excited to get into this today because, all right, this is a completely different thing. But I run a video company, all right? And the question is always in the back of my mind, should I buy the equipment or should I rent the equipment? And that's a big part of what you're answering for Lithko. And so, I know this is completely different stuff, but I think every business owner wants to know that. When does it make sense to buy versus to rent?
Yeah, well, okay, so you were in rental, and then you come over to Lithko. What was Lithko's interest in hiring you? Why did they want to onboard you?
Just a little bit of background on Lithko. Lithko is the second largest concrete construction company in the country. We have 25 offices in 15 different states. And at the time that I joined, we had 7 offices in 6 states. And if you can imagine, a lot of contracting companies of various kinds, whether they be mechanical or concrete or whatever they are fairly geographically bound, right? They're in one town or they're in a small regional geography. But when you have multiple sites across the country, scaling up from equipment ownership, parts facilities, maintenance, becomes a challenge. It's also capital intensive to own the equipment that you would need on the types of jobs that we do, whether that be telehandlers or skid steers or mini excavators. So having a capital constraint along with a scalability issue put them in the mindset of wanting to be more in the rental space than it did the ownership space. Not from necessarily the aspect of thinking that it was a cost saver per se. It was just a method of operating that they needed to be in. But if they were going to be in that space, they wanted to make sure that they were managing it as efficiently as they could. So I got introduced to them, and we started talking about various ways that you could measure things. And the old adage that if you can measure it, you can improve it was very much what we were thinking we were going to get into when we started this journey. And so from that perspective, it became apparent that my background in rental was going to allow me to transition into the contracting space for this particular opportunity, because they wanted to be able to manage as well or outmanage the rental companies from the perspective of knowing what you have, where it is, how long you need it, what you're paying, all the things that are important to a contractor that are, quite frankly, difficult to manage, right? You might have a bunch of paper POs at that time, or stuff written down in notebooks, whatever. Maybe you were even advanced enough to have it in a spreadsheet, but it becomes a challenge to share that information across your organization, certainly. And it also becomes a challenge to have that information be as accurate as what the rental companies have. They know how much you're paying. They know how long you're going to have it based on what you've told them. And there's a flexible model of pricing in rental. It's not 5 days does not equal a week and 4 weeks does not equal a month kind of an approach. It's a scale based on day, week, and month rental rates. And that's not the easiest thing to do in a spreadsheet. It can be done, and we were doing it when I started, but we figured there had to be a better way. But the me coming on board with Lithko was really about that. It was about the desire to not be outmanaged by the rental companies on the end cost of equipment. My boss at the time asked me if I understood what my role was after I'd been there about 4 months. And I was like, ooh, that's kind of a loaded question. And I use a bunch of words and I speak around a whole bunch of things and I'm just trying to fill space, right? But he very succinctly put that my job was to make the end cost of equipment a competitive advantage, right? Mm-hmm. Straightforward, one sentence. And so from that perspective, I took the challenge, even before that, but from that point on, it was very much about how am I going to make this a competitive advantage for Lithko in a space where, contractors by and large own equipment. And many times when times are tight, it's real easy to lie to yourself and you can just sort of bury cost, not charge jobs, not put it into the budget of the job or the estimate of that job, and you can win jobs at a cheaper price. Well, it's cheaper, but at some point the bill comes due. You have depreciation on that equipment. You have to maintain it. You have to move it around. It isn't free, but you can make it look that way, which you can't do really effectively with rental. So that was a challenge, and there's lots of things we're going to dive into around that. But that's sort of the background of why I'm with Lithko and how I came to be at Lithko.
We were talking about how, even within the family, like there's this mentality of like, if I can put it in the job and buy the tool, I'm going to buy the tool. Like that's where I'm going to start out. And then I know when we talked on our pre-call, it was like, how many times do you see that piece of equipment with like grass growing up in the
Sure.
in the yard? And you guys you've come at that very strategically and very differently. So it's helped you scale.
Sure.
Right. But it is a pushback at the like prevailing thought a little bit. So like get into that a little bit. Like, why do you believe in that?
The idea, it's really about the scale aspect of it and the visibility and awareness. Because when you're renting something, the clock is ticking, right? So you have to be aware of what your costs are. Where if you own a piece, you could just sit it on the job and it can almost become part of the background of the
fixture.
job.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily think of it in those terms, but when it's rental and that clock is ticking, when you don't need it, you need to be done with it. It can help keep you on task from a schedule perspective. It's certainly one of the ones that can run away from you, as a job has schedule delays, whether it be weather or trades in front of you not getting out of the way, whatever it may be, the clock does not stop ticking on your rental equipment. You can ice guys at home. You cannot have guys in on the job site and not be paying labor, but the equipment clock is still ticking. So you got to be really cognizant of that and hyper aware of that. So the reason that we feel strongly about the rental side of it comes from that scalability. I've often said, as we've acquired companies around the country, we're everywhere from Salt Lake City to Allentown, Pennsylvania, and all the way down south to the Orlando area. So we're across multiple time zones and across the geography that I explained. And when we've acquired companies, one of the things that I will always tell an owner is they're usually that one town guy, right? Mm-hmm. And it's very easy to convince yourself that owning equipment is the right answer. And I will typically agree with them in their scenario. If I'm you and if I'm in your town and in your shoes, I'm probably thinking that owning that skid steer is better than renting that skid steer. Because if I just purely look at the rate, at some point to me, I'm going to have paid for that skid steer. So it will effectively be free to me. Mm-hmm. It may become part of my yard and have weeds growing up through it because it has worn itself out. And that's completely understandable. And I typically agree with them on a unit for unit basis. It would be better to own than to rent. But when you start scaling up and you're doing multiple projects across multiple parts of not only the country, but even just your town or your state, the next job that you get is going to require a telehandler, right? So how many is too many to own? Mm-hmm. If you own enough equipment that you never need to rent anything, and I'm sure, being in construction, you guys have rented equipment. Everybody that's listening to this, that's in construction, will have rented equipment. So from that perspective, if you own enough that you never need to rent, you definitely own way too much. But if you ever need to rent anything, I would argue that there's a path forward to only renting. Because if you think about it, we're a subcontractor. We specialize in concrete construction. Why does every GC not do all their concrete construction? Why do they not do their mechanicals? Why do they not do whatever it is? Because that's not their specialty, right? And some do, right? There's self-performed GCs out there, but then they also augment that by hiring subcontractors to do work. We do that for many companies, but we are a specialty contractor. Well, we think of it the same way from an equipment perspective. The equipment rental companies are specialty contractors, and we are going to sub out that portion of the job. Now, the important thing for us, so coming back to the acquisitions, when we acquire companies and I have that conversation with an owner or a key ops guy, and I mea culpa that I agree with why they own, I alternately ask them, wouldn't it be just as effective if you have a correct estimate that includes the cost of rental, right? So as long as your estimate is correct and it includes the cost of your rental equipment plus profit, right? So you're putting profit on your cost of the job. That included your rental equipment. And the owner's willing to pay that, let them. It's sort of like Moneyball when they're talking about bunting. And the guy's like, don't try and be a hero. If they lay down a bunt, pick it up, throw it to first, say thank you, take the out. Similar kind of thing. If the owner's willing to pay you for the cost of your rental equipment plus profit, and you can manage that cost and not overrun, right, and start eating into your profit, let them. Why not? It's not your money. I mean, effectively, if you are a company that is happy with your profit margin, you manage your processes and you have correct estimates, what's the problem? You're going to take a lot of risk to try and get that equipment cost lower, but you're taking on a lot of risk because you have to have mechanics, parts rooms. You've got to lay out cash, take cash out of the bank. And I'm not an accountant. I don't play one on TV. I don't do anything. So from that perspective, it's not easy for me to get into the nuts and bolts from an accounting perspective about why ownership is better from a tax perspective or a write-off or a depreciation. I'm not thinking about those things because that's not my job. My job is to make sure that the vision we have is managed the best that it can be, understanding that we have the cost in the correct estimate and that we're making profit on it. And if I can do that on a small portion of the job like equipment, more's the better. Right. So that's very important for us. And that's sort of why we feel strongly about the rental process. And we're going to get into a lot of the details about how we manage that and what's important in those things. But that's a little bit of the background on the why.
Lithko has scaled aggressively. Mm-hmm. And when I think through the problem that is like scaling a company, mm-hmm. period, but then scaling a large company aggressively, spreadsheets and paper might have been good at the beginning, but I would imagine you've got a problem of scale created around the management of all sure. this rental equipment. Mm-hmm. So that's where kind of Quickbase come in. Sure. You've gone more dashboard based in your approach. So let's sure. talk there.
Yeah, walk us through that whole process. How do you track this?
So we started off with spreadsheets. Still use spreadsheets today for a lot of things.
Sure.
They're great. They're usually faster. You can on the fly, edit whatever you want, put a column in here, a row there, all that is very easy to do, right? Not super shareable. I mean, you can do it, and there's organizations that do it just fine. But when you start to scale to the size that we are, we were. I explained the geography and the size, but just to give you a scale of revenue, and this isn't any secret information. We're in the ENR 600. We're in the top 20. We have been for a couple of years now. So all the information's out there, but we went from a $135 million company when I joined in 2008 to a $1.8 billion company just this past year. So that's significant growth in a fairly fast period of time.
Yes, it is.
And if you then think about that rolled forward another 15 years, it's a $10 billion company. We're going to have to add enough work every year to get there that is the size of the company today. Like that's mind-boggling to think about. And when you're thinking about that, you got to think about your processes and your procedures. And then there's the tools that help you manage those processes and procedures. So from the spreadsheet world, I realized there was a couple things. There was an impediment to sharing the information effectively. There was absolutely, and we'll dive down as many rabbit holes as you want to on this, but one of the secret sauces for us, and it's not really secret, a lot of construction companies do this. It's important to know where you're ending up on the job, what your cost will be at complete. And you have to know where you are today, right? So there's that gap. You have to know where you're going and where you are today. And you have to manage the in-between, certainly, because that at complete is whether you're on or you're off budget, right? Mm-hmm. And that's going to be a profitable job or a non-profitable job. We're not in the habit of donating our time and energy and doing work for free, right? This is not a not-for-profit company. So we have to manage that. And in order to manage that, we needed the right tools. And in order to manage a particular portion of that, i.e. equipment, we needed a tool better than a spreadsheet. And so when we got turned on to Quickbase, it was really about, hey, check this thing out. It might be a really good tool to use for a CRM, right? Which it would be. But as I got to investigating, why me? I'm the equipment guy, right? I'm not the IT guy. But at the time, we didn't have an IT department. So it, by default, rolled down to me because I was the resident spreadsheet jockey and solving all the world's problems one spreadsheet at a time. And it was like, well, okay, test this out. Come back and let's see what we can do. And as I got to using the tool, I realized what other problems I could solve with it. And in fact, we don't use it for a CRM at all. We don't even have a CRM because in our organization, that's not the North Star for us to have a CRM approach to managing relationships with customers. That's not how we do it. So instead, I realized that Quickbase was going to allow us the opportunity to take our spreadsheets out of spreadsheet land and put them into the cloud in a way that didn't require anybody to be an IT expert, a coder, a classically trained MIT guy that knows how to code software and do all this stuff. It's a very handy no-code, low-code tool that allows just a common person with enough sense about technology can follow along. Not only do they have sort of pre-built applications that might be able to solve a problem or are the foundations for solving a problem. It's sort of like buying a box of Legos that's designed to be an X-Wing fighter from Star Wars. Well, they're giving you that. You can use the bits and pieces to make the X-Wing look different if you want. But really, they've got that. But they've also got just a big box of Legos they'll sell you too. And that's really what Quickbase can be. I always use the analogy that it's like the difference between something, a software that's built, purpose-built, and we know them by name, but I'm not going to name them all on here. But you can buy the best of breed software to solve a thing. We'll use an ERP system. You can buy a software that's already canned up, ready to go, and is an ERP system. And with that, you have limited flexibility, right? Mm-hmm. It's sort of like they built the sandcastle, and all they'll do is they'll give you a stick and say, well, you can draw a few windows in. But the sandcastle is what the sandcastle is. Where Quickbase comes in with a truck and dumps the pile of sand in front of you and says, build whatever sandcastle you want. Or it can be that. And so when I realized that was the case, I decided to start attacking things that needed collaboration. Equipment is, obviously I came from the equipment side. So for me, first and foremost, now why equipment versus some other thing? And you guys have in your experiences, I don't know, you chime in here and tell me if I'm off base on this. On almost any job, no matter what kind of contractor you are, the two largest portions of your cost are labor and material, okay? Equipment is usually third. It's a distant third, but it's third. It adds up to a lot of money, and certainly as you scale the way we've scaled, it becomes a lot of money. And so me being in that space, I wasn't going to attack labor and material because we have other tools that help us do that. But equipment was sort of left off in no man's land with spreadsheets. And it's very collaborative. And what about it is collaborative is that in order for you to know that question of where I'll be at the end with equipment, you have to be very cognizant of what the end date will be. When will I be done with this piece of equipment? Because when I'm done with that piece of equipment, then changes the amount that I'll pay, right? If I'm going to keep something for 2 weeks and a day, that's one set of rate value versus if I'm going to keep it for a whole month. And the key is to understand that usually at that 2 weeks and a day point, it tips over to be the monthly rate anyway. So you really have it for free for the next week and a half. Mm-hmm. But you have to understand where you'll be. So there's a collaboration. So we needed a tool that was going to allow us to collaborate on that. So from that perspective, Quickbase became, and I'll get more into this, but I want to throw this back to you and see where your head's at. That became the reason Quickbase allowed us to do that, because it's easily shareable across your entire organization. One, it's in the cloud. You don't need any added hardware. Any browser can work as long as you have access to it. And you don't run into conflict issues. You can both have a record open at the same time, and whoever saves it first. Now, there can be issues with that, right? As an organization, you have to know stay in your lane, right? Not everybody can be working on the same thing all at one time. That's not a very effective way to do anything, because one guy should be the owner of that, right? And he's the one telling the system or whatever your tool is, this is the end date for that rental. When I hit save, anyone else can see it in a moment's notice. It's live for everybody through dashboards, through reporting, through automatic notifications that can be set up to be sent. So if I'm an operations manager on a job site and someone in the office, my project superintendent, or we call them project coordinators, they're sort of the checkbook keeper of a job. They're managing all the takeoff and the buyout and all the things that are important to the cost of a job. And the ops guys are out running the job. When I'm done with something, we can have it set up that notifications can be sent. So that's why the collaboration of a thing like Quickbase becomes so important.
So you guys have taken Quickbase and kind of made it your own, right? You've taken the sand that they've given you and you've made your own sandcastle out of it. So like, what kind of things have you developed within the tool that have really started helping you, saying things maybe like short-term planning and things like that?
Sure. Yeah. So for us, it probably falls in the vein of short-term planning, but really our whole secret is we're always short-term planning, right? So our whole approach is to know that whole, where are you going, right? So from a Quickbase perspective, the things that we've developed and utilized that we find invaluable are having really good, well thought out reports and dashboard items. There's might be a misconception about what a dashboard is or how you would use it from a Quickbase tool perspective. Whenever you can run any kind of report, you can build any kind of report that really you can think of, and you have to be very diligent about the fact that report solves a very particular question in your organization, whatever that question is for you. Because again, it's not just information for information's sake. You just don't want to throw up thousands of records and expect a person to know how to suss out what it is they need. So we started off very much just utilizing reports for that. And then Quickbase developed within the last number of years the ability for you to create dashboards. They always had a homepage that had a landing spot for different reports, but they've created dashboards that allow you to the difference. And for the Empower folks, they are already going to know this, but a homepage is more app oriented. The information has to be in that app. So if you guys haven't really used it a ton, the information has to exist within that application for you to use it on a homepage. But when they introduced something called dashboards, and we called those dashboards before because that's just the word we used. But when they actually came out with dashboards, they made the ability for you to pull in information and reports from other applications. And when I say applications, I mean applications within Quickbase, not your other systems. You can get it into Quickbase, and that's a whole other thing. But if you're tracking information about jobs, as I mentioned, people, as I mentioned, and equipment, as I mentioned. If you wanted a dashboard that allowed you to see something from each of those, it really didn't exist very well in Quickbase before. So within the last number of years, they have opened up dashboards, and that has allowed you to pull in that information into a singular space. And from that, you're now able to have a very good, clean look at information that is specific to whatever problem it is you're solving. For us, in this example, it could be the equipment side of it. That team that I mentioned that does their equipment coordination for the whole country, we have a dashboard that allows them to easily operate on the things that they need to focus on. Think about you've got a logbook or a spreadsheet, and you have something that's left open, right? You didn't close it out. It's not done yet, right? Well, if you're in Quickbase, same thing. But how do you see and get back to those open items quickly? And how do you then have management be able to supervise that, right? Because for us, one of our big marching orders or our mantras is LMS. It's leadership, management, and supervision. So if we're going to lead, there's a particular thing you're trying to solve, and we're going to attack that problem. That's leadership. That's looking around multiple corners, right? A lot of people are good at looking straight ahead at what's coming at them. But the leaders have to look around corners. What's the next thing, right? So from a leadership perspective, what are you trying to solve for? The management is, what processes and procedures are you going to bring to bear on that topic, right? And then the supervision is, you then have to track how you're doing with those processes and procedures to solve that problem. So in this example, my leadership approach was, I need to be able to have a window into the quality of work we're providing. So how do we do that? We use Quickbase to create dashboards that allows us to package all of the open items for various things, because maybe it's today, one aspect of it is I've got POs that have been written and brought into Quickbase that don't match my records for that job. And so I got to track down where is that problem, who is it with, and how do we solve that? Conversely, I mentioned our process for partnering with vendors on a job. Well, Quickbase allows us to, by knowing that we have, that's the other thing that we didn't get into, but I will here from a Quickbase perspective, we are able to open up the content of Quickbase to our outside third parties. So from our vendor perspective, we are able to share with them access to Quickbase in a very narrow way that allows them to participate in the process of us selecting a vendor. And that's through a bid process. We submit all of our jobs out for bid. We had to bid on jobs to win them. And we then require our vendors to bid on them to be our first call vendor, right? So we're able to do that in Quickbase, in a system like Quickbase. And they are then able to give back the information we need for us to make our decision. But until we've made the decision, it's an open item, right? It's workflowing, right? It's at a step, there's a next step, and then there's the final step, something like that. And so the dashboards allow us to have all of those little buckets of things to do, be very consistent, very segmented. And from the LMS perspective, that allows us to supervise, right? Because we had the thought that we needed to solve for that. We used Quickbase as the tool to be our process and procedure program around that thing. And now the dashboards allow us to supervise to that. So we're able to do that on whatever it is. I use it for equipment coordination, but the safety team uses it for a whole different thing. What trainings are expiring? What OSHA recordable incidents do we have out there that we still have to close the loop on from a regulatory perspective? And all those things are able to be done in a system like Quickbase. Now, we could call that short-term planning, call it long-term planning. Really, it's just about management of information, right? So all of those things allow us to sort of skin the cat the way we want to. And so for folks that are in the industry that are solving a different problem, it's a different cat they got to skin. Quickbase is going to help them do their version of LMS. What is the problem? What is the processes and procedures, and how can I supervise it? A tool like Quickbase allows for all of those things, as long as you have the vision and the desire to put it in place. So, a lot of times construction companies are maybe not the most apt to want to change, right? So, if you're going to solve some new thing and you're going to put a tool in a guy's hand that he hasn't used before, you have to have fortitude to drive that change out into your organization. Quickbase is just another extension of that. But the beauty of it is through mobile, through access through iPads, your desktops, whatever it is, the ability for the guy in the field to have impact on the data that helps them short-term, long-term, whatever term plan is exponentially better in a tool like Quickbase. That's not to say it's the best at everything in the world, right? I mean, there are plenty of softwares out there that do a lot of really great things, but very few of them have you with the tools to do it if you're not a programmer and if you are not just solving that one problem they do. They're an observations tool for safety incidents. There's a great tool for that. Super. Well, you could build it in Quickbase, and when you build it in Quickbase, it can also plug into your OSHA side of compliance, where the inspection software, not so much, right? So you have to be able to have the vision of what you want to do with Quickbase, and then, quite frankly, you just got to jump in there and start building your sandcastle.
I want to get into the tactical aspects some more, right? Because you had mentioned, setting timeframes for different things. What things are you tracking in Quickbase? Like what elements are important for you guys to track? And then also how does it get tracked? How does it get pulled into Quickbase? So let's start first with what are you tracking?
Sure.
Yeah.
So it's not a replacement for our ERP system. We have an ERP system. We do not use Quickbase for our ERP system because in that space, an ERP system has already been well thought out for, in our example, the construction industry, most specifically for subcontractors. Helps manage change orders and all those things. Not that you couldn't create that in Quickbase and you could design it, no problem. But we didn't need it for that. What we did need it for were all those other things. So what are those things? Equipment we talked about. I'll go deeper into that. Safety. A lot of companies that are either small or scaling and growing often find that keeping track of things on forms or spreadsheets or whatever is how they manage safety, from certifications to trainings to incidents, whatever it may be. We decided that equipment was the first one because that's where I lived.
Right.
But then very quickly we realized what we could do with it in addition to that, and that became safety. So for us, and most people would be this way. If you're going to have 3 legs of a stool, what are the 3 legs of our stool from a Quickbase perspective? One is jobs. So we track what jobs we have in Quickbase. They come from another system because we set them up in our ERP. But for the general runabout guy that's in an office who maybe doesn't have access to your ERP system, or it's not built for dashboard type information or easy reporting on things, we load our jobs in. So that's one part of it. That's one leg of our stool. We load our people in because if I'm going to do something like safety, it usually happens on a job to a person. So you need the job, you need the person. And then the equipment side of it is, could be safety. If you have a near hit incident on a job site with a person, now there's the third leg of your stool because maybe you had a close call on a potential forklift accident on a job site. Well, now you got the job, the person, the equipment. So those are the key pillars of information that we track in Quickbase: our jobs, people, and equipment. And that allows us to, because Quickbase is great at this, it's easy to integrate them together and pull information from either one to be used in how you want to manage whatever that thing is you're managing, i.e. incidents. If you have an incident, you're going to pick the job from a linked table or from another application. It's sort of like in a spreadsheet when guys do tabs in a spreadsheet and they might do a VLOOKUP and they might want to bring information from one spreadsheet portion over to another based on a value. It's that, but on steroids, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're able to do all those things. So we're tracking equipment, people, and jobs. And from that, we can attack things like cost on the job for equipment, incidents on the job, keeping our safety record straight, understanding that we're compliant with all the OSHA regulations, training of those people to meet the requirements that are whatever the GC or the job or OSHA requires. So we use it for those things. There's a lot of side things that get tracked, but it's really about using one of those or two or all three of those things to manage a process like safety, like equipment use, like COVID was a good one. Everybody that's watching this probably, well, unless they're really young, lived through the process of COVID at their workplace. And if you were in construction, which across the country was deemed a necessary industry, and fortunately was in most places allowed to keep working, but there were requirements put on you that you needed to make sure you were taking temperatures, that you were documenting that information for later when it was going to be needed by whether it's your GC, if you're a subcontractor like us, or some other agency that comes in and asks. Well, when COVID presented itself, we were able to quickly spin up within that same day an application because we had the people and we had the jobs, and all you had to do was add the extra bits that you needed to track. It could have been, in this example, it might have been the temperature taken and the date that was done for that employee on that job. And now you've got that record. But it could be anything. It could be forklift training or signaling and rigging. It can be whatever it is. And we were able to spin that up quickly so that our safety people who were manning the post on the COVID stuff were able to quickly adapt with that tool to solve that problem. Other companies probably would have been challenged to do it a different way and maybe not as effectively. So that's a great example of how quickly you can adjust to a thing that you need as long as you've got the core fundamentals in place. And for us, it's those three things.
Yeah. But I'm going to keep pushing into the equipment aspect of this because that's your specialty, right?
Yep.
Is immediately what I'm thinking of, okay, I'm gonna rent this forklift and I have now information that tells me every time I do, this thing breaks down like crazy. Like this thing is plagued with issues, right? Are you able to pull data like that too? Is that something that you're trying to track?
Sure. Well, yes and no.
Okay.
On the equipment rental side,
yeah,
not so much, because the beauty of equipment rental is you pick up the phone and you say, hey, I need a different one because this one's broke.
Right.
So you really, as long as you're made whole and as long as it doesn't affect too much downtime,
yeah.
Yes, and you would go back and you'll fight for those credits later. But yes, we can track that. We do put some of our owned assets in and we track all that stuff.
Yeah.
Maintenance history, what we do, all those things. Yes. So since we're going to go down the equipment rabbit hole, here's the process for us. It's really only going to be as good as whatever data you put in it, obviously. And you have to have a process and a procedure to get that done. So for those of your audience that are really tuning in because they want to understand how you outmanage, if you will, the equipment rental companies, is sort of this is our approach to that. The equipment companies, by and large, your major ones, your United Rentals, your Sunbelts, all the ones you have around here, we use them all across the country. And many of them have a customer portal. It's an online browser-based interface with your data. You can see what you have on rent, what you have had on rent, your current invoice processing, what you owe, all those things. And they're pretty good. Some are better than others, but they're pretty good. Problem is, if you use more than one rental company on a job site, now you got to go to 2 and 3 and 4 places. And then when you get into some of the companies, whatever your local rental shop is, likely does not have a customer portal, right? So now you're doing what? And because all that disparate information is in all those different places, including possibly your job folder where you've got, delivery tickets and crap, you have all this spread out info. So This is why I also talked about agreeing with owner operators that owning equipment makes a lot of sense when they are of their scale. At some point, you have to be of a scale where this makes sense. Okay, so here's the process. We have centralized rental or sourcing for equipment. Anywhere we're working around the United States on any of our 600 plus jobs active at any one time, they call into one office to get their equipment. So we don't want to have highly skilled, highly paid, really quality construction guys being desk jockeys and being, admin people, if you will, right? Now, those guys have relationships, as you guys, I'm sure, do, and everybody watching and listening would, that they know the guy at rental company X. And he's my buddy from back in school or whatever, right? And I really want to use him, so that's my relationship. That's fine. We understand those things. But the real art of it is having a way to put that information into your tool, in this example, Quickbase. And for us, it's centralized sourcing. So they call in, they request a skid steer, and they hang up. A few more questions we ask: how long, what size, all the things that you need to know. They hang up and they keep working with confidence that the machine is going to show up when we needed it to be. They didn't have to do anything to do that. When it breaks, they call that same number, hang up with confidence it's going to be taken care of. And when they're done with it, they call that same number with confidence that it'll be picked up and that everything's good to go. The team on the backside is taking that rental transaction from cradle to grave. It's not just simple one call now, another call when it breaks, and then another call when it's done. It's not that simple. And we don't want those highly skilled, highly paid guys doing that. We have other guys that are highly skilled and highly paid, but within their lane, doing equipment sourcing. And they are writing the purchase order, making sure the information is loaded into Quickbase. It is a manual process. It's not automated, because if you think about all the rental companies that there are in the United States and how many we would rent from, it's a lot.
Yeah.
Right? You don't have automated processes where information is pushed into Quickbase. It could be, right? There are APIs that you can have set up where information is pushed directly into Quickbase from whatever your system is. As long as the rental vendor would agree to that, that'd be fine. Problem is, in that example, what are you doing? You're taking your word for it. They're loading the information into their system. And it may not surprise you to know that through our process of, we still use paper and pen. We have log books. We write down our notes and our information. We attack that problem with a vendor that we choose. We get it solved and we load it into Quickbase. And when we load it into Quickbase, we then validate what the vendor says. And it's not going to surprise you to know that they don't always have the right rate on it. They don't always have the right purchase order number on it. Hell, they may not even have the right job number on it, right? So not that they're doing that all the time, but if you didn't have a backstop for that, where would you find it? How would you find it? When would you find it, right? So our process is, guy calls and gets it, hangs up, goes back to doing what he's paid to do. My team takes it from there, source it, load the information, and manage that process from beginning to end. Now, why Quickbase to do that versus just a spreadsheet? Because when that guy calls and says, I need that skid steer loader on a job, and he gives you a date that he thinks he needs it till, there's a really good chance that's going to change. Okay. So that's that whole piece of knowing where you'll be at the end, right? So the way it works is, we're going to load it. But at Lithko, once a month for every job that we have, that project coordination group that I talked about, that is the checkbook guy for the job, and the project team together discuss all manners of things. How many more hours are we going to have on this job for whatever phase we're in? What other material is going to be coming in that we haven't ordered yet or that we need to get coming in? What equipment do we need in the future? And of the equipment that we have on rent today, how long will we need it? Because when you put all those pieces together, what you've ever had, what you have today, and what you'll have in the future adds up to your total equipment cost. And you need to be able to collaborate on that. That is not for my team to do. My team does not know what phase you're in and how long you're going to need stuff. They are not the experts at that. But they've loaded the information and provided you quality information at a good rate. And now as a project team, Quickbase allows for collaboration on that. And they do that through going in and very simply through dashboards and through other parts of the program, being able to see that on my job, I have 10 pieces. And those 10 pieces are projected to be out until some date. 10 different dates, all the same date, don't know, doesn't matter. On each one of those pieces, you can say, here's my new end date because of a change order that requires a schedule change. And we're going to be out there longer to do some new phase, right? But I can put that in and it immediately calculates for you, because we built it that way, it immediately calculates for you your end cost. Now, you guys have been in construction and probably understand this, but if you know where you're at and you know where you're going to be, you know how much is going to be left to hit your job. So those are the two things. It's really hard to know how much is left if you don't know where you're at and where you're going to end. So being able to know where you're going to end and trusting that your AP process is aligned and that the bills have come in and they're in your information stream, you know where you're at, you know where you're going to be, and that allows you to make a educated projection of cost on that job. So long-winded answer to a very short question. But the idea is that you have to have good quality information. And if you rent from a lot of different vendors on a job site, as you are likely to do, you're going to need to have it all in one place. Quickbase is the way that we're able to do that. And it works very effectively for us on that aspect of it. We try to make the end result of interface with the project team as effortless as possible. We don't want them to have to remember where to go find it, have a bunch of keystrokes or mouse movements to make the picture what they want it to be at the end. We package it up in a very clean and easy way that they can view on their job everything they've ever had, everything they have, and everything they've said they'll need in the future. And they do that with a minimal amount of keystrokes and effort. A lot of thought goes into it, but we try to reduce the number of keystrokes and the mouse movements. So that's what we're trying to do.
You guys you're holding your rental suppliers to task, I'll say to task on rate, because you know, and you're using the inertia of the whole company to gather data to inform those decisions and to inform those rates. So you're not
Correct.
Like, your local guy isn't guessing like whether he got a good deal on the excavator he just got. He's like, you've offloaded that, and this has a bottom line impact. So,
Sure.
I mean, as you guys have kind of implemented this process, what kind of bottom line impacts have you seen?
Yeah, so first upstream from that is, that's right. How do you know? The one thing that the information allows us to influence is that we're not always going after every single deal trying to find the bottom best price on that deal. We're trying to find it in whole for the job. And we oftentimes do that by partnering with a vendor on a job. Now that changes from job to job, or it can, and it certainly changes across geography because your A player in Charlotte, North Carolina may not be your A player in Salt Lake City, Utah. So you have various vendors that support you well in your various markets. And so what we try to do is we try to use the information from the past to influence our decision-making on who we're going to partner with in the future on a job. And when we partner with them, it's nothing contractual. It's no written agreement. It's a handshake agreement that you're offering us pricing for the life of that job. And we're going to agree that if we select you, we will try to use you 80 to 85% of that job. Sometimes you just flat out can't use one vendor. It's okay for them to tell you no from time to time when you call up and you say, hey, it's 6 months into the job and I need this particular size dozer, and they don't have that. You're going to go to who you need, right? You're not waiting around for them. And they understand that. Like it's not a thing. But because you drove for the right deal at the beginning and you've agreed to use this vendor for the life of that job and the majority of that job, it allows you to have a degree of influence with them and get the best price that you can in whole. All right. So that's sort of the first step in it. From a bottom line impact, from a company perspective, that approach has allowed us to do a few things. Without going too far into the numbers, let's just say that in 2007, the year before, I'm not going to make it sound like it's the year before I joined. Before we started implementing a new process and a procedure and implemented Quickbase as the tool to help us with that, since that time, we have cut our bottom line equipment cost to the job in half. Now, if you think about it in terms of every point, 1 percentage point on a $1.8 billion company, it's a lot of money, right? And if you can get 2, that's even better. So we've been able to take our equipment cost and cut it in half through processes and procedures. Now, there's other things that have impacted that, certainly. Scale and scope of jobs. A bigger job needs less equipment as a factor of revenue. Meaning, there's 2 different ways that we'll track equipment cost on a job. It's either dollar per man hour. So the reason that we would track it on a dollar per man hour side is other outside influences aren't affecting your revenue. So if you use a percent of revenue as your driver of or a metric to understand cost, that can be variable because not every job do you carry the material cost. The owner may buy the material on a job and your revenue is lower because of that. You needed the same equipment. Owner just bought the material. On another job, you may have the material in there that inflates your revenue and that thus makes your equipment percent of revenue go down, right? So when we realize that's good from a top line perspective to understand as a whole, because by and large, the organization doesn't have big sea changes in 1 year, all the owners were buying equipment, and another year they weren't buying the equipment or the material. It doesn't happen that way. It's just here and there, right? So on a high level, that's a fine metric. But the labor side is the better metric because whether they buy the material or whether they don't buy the material, you need the same labor and you need the same equipment. So your dollar per man hour, and a lot of folks would think of things in terms of estimating on a price as a factor of the unit, X dollar per unit. Our unit in this example would be labor hours. It could be cubic yards. It could be square foot. It could be whatever. But whatever that thing is to you, ours is labor. And so what we do is we attach equipment as a dollar factor of labor. Now, the scope of a job, what was once $1 million job now is a $2 million job. You're using the same equipment to do that job. And the rates, fortunately, I would knock on wood, but I don't want to mess up the recording, is that it has gone up, but not by as much, right? So we've been able to commoditize rental from our perspective because it's not a commodity to us, and I don't want our vendors to think that we think of them in those terms, but by making it a commoditized approach, we've been able to not have rates go up at the same level as labor, the end cost of the job, material, certainly, with all that's gone on, whether it be fasteners for the roof and so the roofing guy can get out from in front of you so you can do the slab. All those things, COVID just killed all that and drove prices through the roof on a lot of things. Fortunately, equipment was one where we were able to hold it in check. So the bottom line impact has been massive. Now, at some point, you're going to run out of room. There's not any juice left in that turnip to squeeze. So you have to utilize the information from your system in an ever smarter way to try and get that juice. And that's going to be the challenge now and going forward.
You still have economized and you still have achieved the goal that the boss man said was at hand, which was, we want you to make this a competitive advantage for our company.
Correct.
That competitive advantage is there. You're just continuing to hone and try to get as sharp as you possibly can be. So that's how generally processes work, right?
Sure.
You've got a lot more fat to whittle off the beginning, and then you get very dialed in at the end. But you've got the inertia of all of that time and all that effort and all of that trimming.
That's right.
That's being brought to bear on every single project. So this is a competitive advantage for Lithko.
We think that it is. And I don't want to make it seem like, it's not a one size fits all. So your application, your viewers are in a different space, doing different work potentially with a different scale and scope. And to them, the decision may not be the same. But the tool can be the same and can be brought to bear on whatever their version of that problem is. For us, it was to make renting equipment a competitive advantage. When the housing crisis, I joined Lithko during the bubble, and then I've lived through COVID with them, and so we've had some headwinds from time to time. And during headwinds, when the tide goes out. When you're renting equipment and the tide has gone out, you still have to rent equipment. Those companies are still looking to make money, right? They're not a not-for-profit either. So we have to make sure that we're able to work our way through that process when it may not be as much of an advantage, but when the tide comes back in and all ships are raised, same thing. We've got different issues. The example with owning equipment is when work starts to dry up and margins get tighter, the banks still come calling for whatever you owe them on the piece of equipment you bought. But with rental, the way we've managed it on our side is that if your work dries up, you send it home. The bill stops. Now, you can make it through a little while owning equipment, and there's some accounting things you can do to monkey your way around it. And again, I'm not an expert on that, but I know that a couple things. One, when the tide is high and the equipment guys are making money, we're renting a bunch of equipment, and owners are doing well because they're making money on jobs and they're able to pay for their equipment. That's a different challenge for us than when the tide is out. And so we ebb and flow with that. But the entire time we're doing that, we're using the information through dashboards, through quality report. That's the biggest thing. It's not just information for information's sake. I mean, there's a lot of things you can dive into in a system like Quickbase, and you can set it up to track any number of things. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to bring it to bear on a problem and actually have some impact. And so we've been able to do that in the equipment space. But like I was saying to your audience, they're in a different position. And maybe the tool would be most applicable for them to do a better job of tracking their owned assets, tracking their maintenance, tracking their usage. We do that. We own stuff. We don't rent 100%. We own some specialty items for concrete specific, and we have to manage them just like anybody would manage a backhoe or forklift. So we're managing that process through usage and maintenance and when to buy it, when to sell it, all those things. Quickbase is able to do that as well. It's just a different set of processes. It's a different tool, a use of the tool. The tool is built different for rental than it is for ownership. And you just have you have to have the foresight to know what you want to do and how you want to solve it. But very few companies, there are a few, it's becoming more prevalent as I talk to the rental vendors. Very few rental companies have customers that rent as much as we do. Not that we're their biggest account, because we're not the biggest company in the country. I mean, there's lots of other contractors that are much bigger than us, especially in the GC space, and they rent a lot of equipment, right? And it's just a factor of scale. So we're not the number one account with all these vendors, but we have a process of renting more as a percent of our use than many other companies. That's starting to change a little bit. There's more clients that they have that are starting to rent more as a product of the equipment they use on a job is shifting more towards rental. When I was in the rental industry, it was always understood that, generally speaking, it was about 25% of equipment on a job would be a rental approach. Most North American contractors owned the prevalent amount of their equipment. And over in Europe, it was far different from that. It was more 45, 50%, so half and half. And the United States has migrated closer to that approach. Certainly when before COVID and during COVID, when you would go through these lulls in steel availability or whatever the thing was, equipment vendors, manufacturers started stretching out their lead times to enormous lengths of time, which meant that equipment had to last longer on job sites. And because of that, some companies were forced to start renting more than they did in the past because they couldn't find replacements and they couldn't keep their equipment going. And I think what that did was it might have opened their eyes a little bit more to the value in effectively subcontracting out your equipment. Because let's face it, they own more than you'll ever own. They fix more than you'll ever fix. And they have processes that make them experts in equipment asset management. Let them. Again, as long as you've got it in the job with profit, take the out, right? Let it happen.
Rob, this really gets the imagination just kind of stirred up in me, like how you can be, so process driven and also scalable in a company. Like super cool what you've done. But so I want to ask you our megaphone question though. All right. So this is what we ask everybody. So if we gave you a megaphone in around 60 seconds to say something to the industry as a whole, what would you want to say?
I think about everything that I've been through, the different organizations that I've been with and the roles that I've had. And I keep coming back to the word change. I feel like there's, I don't know that I see it as much anymore with the youth. All the ideas that they are going to change jobs multiple times. Heck, they even think of their first marriage as a starter marriage and they're going to change that. But I would say that be open to change, whether that be a process, whether that be a new tool like we've discussed here today. The idea that what you're doing today is the only way to do something and that's the way you're going to need to do it 5 years from now doesn't exist. So whatever industry you're in, whatever role you serve within your company, be willing to accept change and be excited about that change. So many folks have to be led there kicking and screaming that it makes solving a problem way harder than it needs to be. Doesn't mean you're always going to be right or that the change is the right change, but you're going to learn something from that change. And so I would really encourage youth to seasoned guys, be willing to change given the task that's in front of you or the choices you make as a job, a career, whether that be change within the organization or to other organizations. Be open to that because that's the only way you're going to grow is through change.
It's a good one, dude. Heck yeah. Rob, thanks for coming down here to Milledgeville, Georgia and joining us today.
No problem. Appreciate it.